Everyone, and welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Lee Bortons and Tim Knotts and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. We're recording a little early this time. It is a Friday, September 15th, and we all have lots of travel. And actually, Lee is not joining us today because she had a speaking engagement. But we are joined by Kathy Denici, who's been with us this month to talk about economics. She's one of our curriculum developers. So thanks for coming, Kathy.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So this month we are taking a break from literature to talk about economics. And today we're going to talk about Whatever Happened to Penny Candy, which I think is a fabulous title by Richard Mayberry. Last week we talked about his book, The Money Mystery, which we read in Challenge 1. And for the very last one, we'll talk about the Blue Stocking Guide to Economics. That'll end our economics series. And I want to remind all of our viewers / listeners that you can see all the past episodes on Lee Bortons' YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, or on her website, leebortons.com, where you can choose one of the book clubs and go straight to the archives. So Tim, do you want to get us started today?
Sure. Yeah, I love the name of this book too. I sometimes end up telling my children about my trips over to the corner store to buy little 10-cent boxes of candy, and they don't believe me that 10 cents was all it took to get a whole box of candy. Um, so usually, Jennifer, you start off with questioning Lee about why this particular resource is in the Classical Conversations catalog, but since she's not here, you're the next best thing we have to Lee. So why do you understand this book is here in our catalog?
Yeah, well, I think most of our listeners know, but for those of you who don't, we do have a theme for each of the challenge levels. And the theme of Challenge 1, it's all about freedom. And if we're going to maintain our freedom, it's important that we do two things: know about our governing documents that give us freedoms. And so that's the first semester in Challenge 1. And the second thing is to know about economics, because the government intervention in markets is one of the things that may cause us to lose our freedom. And so we have them get a basic understanding of economics. It's also true that everyone who wants to be a free person needs to know how to manage their money well. So I think when we started this series, we talked about the fact that the Greek root of the word economics has to do with running your household well. And then these books help you expand beyond the household into what does it look like for your larger and larger and larger communities, all the way to the national and international level. So it's just giving those basic economic principles that everyone needs to know to succeed as a wise voting adult. What about you guys? Any thoughts about economics?
This is a great time to introduce it to kids who are often sort of on the verge of those first steps into managing their own money in some way, right? Whether it's babysitting money or gifts from family members, they're suddenly arriving at the place where they have sort of real money to spend instead of a few cents or a few dollars here and there.
Right, and it lays the groundwork for them. If they can think about these ideas early, then they can begin thinking about even further into the future.
Yeah, I love that one of our projects in Challenge 1 is how much do I cost? So they get to take a look at how much their expenditures are. And they often find that there's some hidden things they didn't know that their parents were spending money on them. But when they interview them and find that out, it's usually pretty eye-opening. So, well, good. So, Kathy, last week we talked about Mayberry's book, The Money Mystery. Can you tell us how these two books work together to give us a full view of economics?
Yeah, I sure can. So both of these books are part of Mayberry's series. He has an 11-book series called the Uncle Eric series, and they're written as both of the books are written as letters, like an uncle writing to his nephew Chris to talk about economics. I think of Whatever Happened to Penny Candy as more of an overview. It talks about personal economics and then, of course, economics of your country. He describes the Austrian economic model, which is a free market model. He talks about cycles, about, business cycles, velocity, recessions, inflation, and gives some history on inflation. The money mystery that we talked about last week, I feel like goes into more depth. So it focuses in on velocity or the money demand and how that affects us.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that as you said, it's a great overview. So one of the things that happened in our house, because my husband is a wealth advisor, is that oftentimes at dinner, the kids would ask a seemingly innocent question, and all of a sudden Dad was drawing supply and demand curves on paper towels and explaining the economy. But not everyone has that in their household. And so I find that this book actually gives you a really good overview of those ideas, just as you said. So, all right. So Tim, as Kathy said, these are pretty conversational, a letter, they're kind of chatty. So how would you compare that to common economics texts?
Yeah, definitely pretty different than the ones that I read and worked through when I was in high school and college. I do think, interestingly, these two books, just to go back to what Kathy was just saying, touch on really the two great economics principles that our government uses even, right? We have fiscal policy, which has to do with how you spend your money, how make and spend, and monetary policy, which is how do we manage the supply of money in the system. And that mirrors these two books in some ways. We have the monetary book and the fiscal book. So even in that, they're kind of a good foundation for students who may want to go on and read more or learn more in the realm of economics. But they're written in this conversational tone, which is a historical means of communicating truths. Dialogues are a way that philosophers and political scientists have been studying the way things work and trying to teach them for a long time. They're a great way to take real life examples and extrapolate from them into principles rather than the other way around. So most of our textbooks try to generalize as much as they can. They'll draw the supply and demand curves with X's and Y's, and they'll discuss widgets, and no one really has, right? You don't go out and buy a widget. You buy a bicycle or a loaf of bread. And these books do a great job of introducing those economics principles with those simpler examples. And, again, that is much like the way our ancient philosophers would have taught things. Socrates talked a lot about shoemakers and carpenters and ship captains and shepherds to help explore ideas about justice and leadership and love. I think it's easy to hide behind sort of big words and complicated charts in those heavy economics textbooks. It's a lot harder to hide real life examples because when they don't ring true, we know by common experience that something seems off. And last week we talked a little bit about models and how a good economics lesson or a good way to look at economics is by understanding that there's a model that's at work and being explored. And using real life examples is how we test models to see whether they are good models or bad models.
Yeah, I like this reread reminded me of two things. One is that he starts with the very simple concepts that are very, very interesting to kids, just like where did we get money and what is a coin and what is a paper? And he actually has them look at what is on the front of your dollar bill because we exchange them all the time without looking. So I appreciate that about the conversational tone. And then, as you said, he gives good examples. So if you're normally an economics textbook would probably have a complicated formula to talk about the velocity of the dollar. And instead he talks about kids sitting in a circle and spending $1 on a baseball card. And that makes that concept much easier to get a hold of. Now it is more complicated than baseball cards and single dollar bills, but he gives them a great start by giving them a really relatable example. So, I jumped the gun on our next idea, but did you find that this was an effective way to teach this subject? I sort of already answered.
You did, but I think it's effective because he gives us a foundation. He lets us know what ideas are really important so that if we do go on to one of those textbooks or maybe take economics later, we can turn back to these ideas and relate it.
How about you, Tim? I know one of your children just did this last year, right? So
right.
It's fresh on the on the Knott's household mind.
It sure is. Yeah, I mean, I remember trying to teach some things about the stock market years and years ago to some teenagers, uh, and I talked about the New York Stock Exchange, and they gave me blank looks. And then I talked about the Dow Jones Industrial, and they gave me blank looks. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about what is a stock, and they gave me blank looks. And then we talked about what is a corporation, and they didn't understand that. And so we had to back all the way up to really, really simple things to start unpacking the layers and layers and layers that have been built up in our economy around what's really a very simple principle, right? Of people working together, cooperating uh, to make something. And these books do a good job of not trying to jump in at that. Everybody knows what a stock marketplace is, and instead coming down to everyday lived experiences that students can then build on, instead of trying to start big and unpack and unpack and unpack and leave everyone more confused than they started.
Yeah, I think about that every time I teach Challenge 3, because when we get to the Great Depression in the U.S. history book, there's a lot of economic talk in the text that we use, and the students, you can tell they don't quite get it. And so I play a role-playing game where they give them all jobs, and one of them is a baker, and one of them is the person who makes the ovens for the bakery, and one of them is a simple housekeeper, and one of them is a, millionaire business owner. And then we play what happens when the prices change in the economy. And then they kind of get a glimpse into how the Great Depression could happen. So I think that's important to do. All right. Well, so I know Kathy and I at least have kiddos who are out in the world and working and entering the economy for the first time and really experiencing some of these things. So Kathy, did you see them implementing any of these lessons or returning to some of these ideas?
I did. I have 5 kids that are all grown and out in the world and, working. I see most of my kids really trying to save and invest for retirement, invest for the future. And they're trying to do it, especially one of them is trying to do it in ways that their money can grow, but that also can't be eaten away by inflation. If we just stick our money in a savings account, inflation is going to really reduce the value of that money. So I see that. So they've learned something from that. I think most of them are pretty careful with their money too. They're frugal. They know that they're stewards of their money. They've done things like for their own household stewardship. They've bought fixer-upper houses and they've lived in them a few years and then sold and tried another. I do have one that likes to spend money, and so we've talked to him about investing in retirement and planning for the future. And he's starting to do that, but so it doesn't always stick, but he's starting to learn.
Yeah. They all have different personalities. I have
Right.
one spender and then some savers too. So
Yeah,
I know about
exactly.
that. Well, we talked a little bit last week about my son. So he does do this for a living, and his passion for he's an investment analyst for my husband's wealth management firm, and it was partly started truly by Challenge 1 books. He got very interested in these handful of books that we're talking about this month, and then that made him want to read more. So whenever he saw them referring to authors like Henry Hazlitt and some others, and then he heard about Milton Friedman from these Richard Mayberry books, and so he watched all of his, I think it's called Free to Live, something like that. That's on YouTube. All of Milton Friedman's great economic videos that he made in the 80s. And he just got very, very interested. In fact, he got so interested that we took him to the University of Chicago to visit. And they have their sort of, besides the Austrian school, those guys are kind of the famous economists. And so we went to the Gleeker Center to see all of their research in their sort of economics museum, because he got so interested from this. And then just practically speaking, right now, he's looking out at the horizon and going, well, I wanted to buy a car, but now I don't think I do. Because the interest rates are so high. And so he's weighing those decisions now. Should I rent or own a home? do I really need to replace my car right now? So a lot of these examples in the Mayberry book really hit home as conversations we're having right now. So, all right. Well, I think it's about time to have our commercial break. So I want to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where all of the books that we discuss on this book club can be purchased. And if you go to leebortons.com and look at the Words Aptly Spoken calendar, that will link you for the remainder of this year. And then we'll get the 2024 shows up. But right now you can get all the 2023 books and purchase them in advance or purchase them after, depending on what works for you. So next week, we are going to discuss Richard Mayberry's The Blue Stocking Guide to Economics. So if you want to go ahead and grab that one, you can. All right, well, let's get back to our discussion, gang. So in the About section, in the front matter, Mr. Mayberry gives some information about his own views on economics. We talked about last week that he's forthcoming. He lets you know what he thinks and where his ideas have come from. So Tim, do you want to read our first passage for us?
Sure. Yeah, this is actually where he talks about that Austrian model. So why we know that's true of him is from right here. So I'll read it for us. As mentioned in the preface, the book is based on Austrian and monetarist economics. These viewpoints were chosen because good science, good physics, good biology, good chemistry, and good economics depend on the ability to predict. In other words, if a physicist correctly predicts the moment at which a projectile will strike its target, or a biologist correctly predicts the effect of change in the effect a change in temperature will have on a population of insects, then we can say that these scientists are using good science. On the other hand, if the predictions are wrong, then the science is flawed. What
do you think about that, Kathy?
Yeah, I was thinking about that one. I think I would add that if the prediction is wrong, then there's something wrong with the hypothesis or something wrong with the model. And so at that point, it's time for the scientists to go back and reevaluate and rethink what he thought would happen, look for his mistakes. And Mayberry even goes on to say that if an economist's predictions are accurate, then his economics must be good and in tune with the real world. But he says that if his predictions are wrong, he really just has the wrong model and he needs to reevaluate. So we can apply that to economics too and economists.
Yeah, I think that term model is a good one that he doesn't really talk about here. And maybe model better than science would be a good word to insert in this, right? When I hear this, I think about like the weatherman, right? The meteorologist, and this time of year, they're always plotting all those tracks of the Atlantic hurricanes, and you see ones that say, oh, it's going to go this way, and some that say it's going to go that way. And I don't think it's because either one is based on good or bad science, but there's something that their models are taking into account that's different from one another. And just like the weather, economics, especially when you start talking about the national or international level, are extremely complicated. And no one model can take into account all the real life aspects of what might or might not happen. So I think, Kathy, what you said about going back and adapting or self-evaluating what didn't go well or how can I improve my model might actually be the real heart of good scientific inquiry when it comes to economics. Isn't did I anticipate this particular economic event perfectly, but attuning your model to reality.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, I was going to say, I liked what you said about all the different models and so many factors going into, the spaghetti plots of the hurricane, and each of the models is taking in different factors that may or may not happen. I think with the economy, one of the big factors is each individual's decisions in their purchasing or, stewardship of their own money. And you can't predict that. You can't predict a million people's decisions that they're going to make. It's like right before a hurricane, all the bread and the milk and the toilet paper is sold out in the store, right? So that's a lot of individuals making individual decisions that collectively have an effect.
Yeah. And one thing Lee and I talk about all the time is that humans, one of the most charming things about us is that we're wonderfully inconsistent. So that makes for a lot of variables. If you look at our students in algebra, they have very small number of variables to deal with in an equation.
We're also often highly irrational.
Yes.
And so we don't follow models well.
Yes. Yes. And occasionally you do see economists overreaching. So sometimes I have to check my reactions. When we were at that center at the University of Chicago, there was a model by Gary Becker that was an economic model of how people decide to have children. And I was like, this would be fantastically true if everybody rationally made their decisions about when and how many children to have, but I don't think that's always how it works. So,
and of course, if biology also simply obeyed the laws of economics.
Right, exactly. So we've been talking a lot about this idea. I love it that he here mentions physics and biology and chemistry, because some of us forget to think about economics as one of those sciences. We may separate it in our minds, but the same thing is true about models there. So we've been talking in my Challenge 4 class about the heliocentric and the geocentric models of the universe, because we're going back through, the ancient scientists. And so they've been thinking about, for the first time, I can really see them thinking about how to evaluate a model and its predictive ability and its simplicity and or complexity. And they're really starting to think about those questions. So it's fun to have those conversations with them. All right. Well, so speaking of other branches of study, we can talk about math when we're talking about economics. So we talk about laws like the identity law of multiplication, which we memorize these laws in foundations with our very small kids, and then they apply them later. But these laws are principles that apply in known circumstances. And so we don't always think about just like we don't maybe think of economics as being a science, we probably don't think about there being laws of economics. But in our next passage, Mayberry lays out something that he sees like a law of economics. So Kathy, do you want to give us that passage to chat about?
Yeah, he says a law of economics is like a fact of life. It's something you have to live with because you cannot change it. The law is TANSTAFL. And did I pronounce that right? It's an acronym, right?
Yeah.
TANSTAFL, which means there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. TANSTAFL means that nothing of value is free. So somebody must pay for it. If not with money, then with time and hard work.
Yeah. Well, this was a frequently quoted saying in our house. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as a free lunch, comes out of my husband's mouth probably daily.
Nice.
So, but I was new to the acronym. So were you going to say something, Tim?
Yeah, this is one of the takeaways my daughter had from these books. This is one of those phrases or ideas that stuck with her probably more than most. And it's really true and evident when you live through life. Like I'm right now working on a remodeling project, and a moment by moment during it making choices about what do I do myself and what do I pay someone to do. If there's credits like income tax credits available for certain kinds of materials that I might use versus other kinds. Even those don't come free, right? An income tax credit lets me keep some of my money, but in the sphere of national economics, that affects the budget of our whole country, those few $100s perhaps that impact me. So, there's impacts and time and money relate to one another in more ways than just that velocity conversation we're having. But sometimes it's worth your money to pay for someone's time to come do some labor, and sometimes it's worth doing it yourself.
Yeah. I marked the PS to this chapter, which in my copy is on page 41. But he says, Chris, which is, the nephew he's writing to, TANSTAFL, but few voters will face the fact that the real meaning of the cry, I want, is tax me, And I thought that was such a great way to jar people out of their complacency, because anytime we want something special for our congressional district or our state or our community or a certain group of people, we're not sitting there thinking that saying I want this means tax me. And it's important to remember that that's the result. So.
I hear a lot of people talking about, free health care and free education and free this and free that. And they point to other countries that have a lot of that, but they don't often realize what the tax rates are in those countries. And it's super high.
Yeah. And I think Lee would be very disappointed with us if we didn't mention that conversation when it comes to funding of education at the primary and secondary levels, that that when the government comes knocking and says, hey, homeschoolers, we've got some money for you, that's not just money that the government printed out of nowhere and is handing out. That's money that is coming and doesn't come without strings as well. But it, even just at the purely economic level, there are places in, I think, Michigan where they're enrolling homeschool students technically in the public schools so that the money flows down through the school system and so that it will still be taxed and spent the same way. And definitely doesn't come for free.
No, yeah. Usually two things happen. One is that prices go up for all homeschooling services, because when there's money being injected into the system, always prices go up. And then the other thing that happens is that there will be strings attached. I mean, we have a similar system in Oklahoma where you can enroll your kids in virtual public schools. But as soon as you do that, there are strings. And those strings usually look like you might not be able to use the curriculum that you want to use, because now someone has money to hold over you and oversight over you.
Yeah, there's that intersection between economics and freedom that we started off talking about today.
Yeah. And those things always do sound so good. We all want to help people, but I like that these books are helping students to think through what happens when we take those actions. There are consequences. So, which is the theme of Challenge 3. All right. So on our third reading, we get to one of these interesting historical examples that we've been chatting about, which can help us understand what happened at other times. Sometimes it's easy. We talk about this in literature. It's easier to make moral decisions if you can step outside yourself and experience it through a character. You get some kind of distance. And so that happens in economics, I think, when we look at historical examples. It gives us a distance from our own time and place, and that distance allows us to look at it a little more accurately. We don't have emotions wrapped up in something that happened hundreds or thousands of years ago. This one is about a get-rich-quick scheme, and it does show up in a lot of economics texts. So I'll read this one for us. A similar incident, one of the strangest, happened in Holland around 350 years ago. It was called tulip mania. Thousands of the Dutch were looking for a get-rich-quick scheme, and they discovered the idea of investing in tulips. I love this because the kids think this is so weird. So they're immediately paying attention because it's weird to think you were going to get rich quick buying tulips. There were so many people buying tulips and expecting to resell them for a profit that the price of tulips went almost straight up. Of course, after a few years, the tulip mania stopped and prices came back down to reasonable levels. People who sold out before the insanity ended made a fortune, but most of the investors lost a great deal. I love that ending because one of the reasons people continue to gravitate toward these schemes is there are going to be a handful of people who did time it correctly, but they will be the minority. But it's just enough of a minority to keep us coming back to these get-rich-quick schemes. So what did you guys think about tulip mania?
One of my Challenge 4 students actually talked about this recently in community because we were talking about exploring the New World, discovery of the New World, and how the Spanish brought so much gold back that it affected their economy. So not exactly the same thing, but he mentioned the tulips. But what this story made me think about was our own lives and really more questions like what is this tulip mania? Is it similar to what we've heard in the news about Ponzi schemes, where it's a get rich quick and only a few people profit? And then, or what other similar things have we seen in America or in our country?
Yeah. I think in at least the last few decades, the pundits or economists have talked a lot about bubbles, right? That
Mhm.
I think that's what this looks like, this tulip get rich quick scheme. And it happened in the 1920s leading up to the Great Depression with people shorting stocks, right? They would invest trusting things were going to go one way and then they didn't. Um, or thinking back to the like the 90s, you had the eBay Beanie Baby
Oh yeah.
bubble, right? Everyone went out and bought hundreds and hundreds of these Beanie Babies and trusting that some of them were going to be worth a lot and some were going to be continuing to become more and more valuable. And in the end, a lot of people ended up with a lot of Beanie Babies and a lot less money. Um, or in the early 2000s, house flipping, where people would go
Mhm.
out because the housing market was so hot and interest rates were so low, they could buy a house relatively cheap, but only relatively cheap. And when the housing market collapsed, they were stuck with a lot of real estate that wasn't worth what it was and mortgages to pay. Um,
Yeah.
or today, I think about people who invest in all this equipment and try to become an internet influencer, right?
Hmm.
And think that they're going to be rich from being on a YouTube channel or an Instagram channel for a little while. And again, there's a few who might make it that way, but most people, that's no path to wealth or stability.
Yeah, and it happens on the stock market all the time. There are these bubbles where we know we've had a season for a while now, probably 2 decades, where there's been an overinvestment in tech stocks because tech stocks are shiny and new, and it feels like there's endless money in those companies. And it's starting to burst a bit, and those tech companies are having to lay off people because their valuations didn't come in. And it always reminds us, like, there are certain things that never go away. We have to eat. We have to be clothed. So there are certain, reliable things that don't tend to experience the bubbles. And then occasionally we get our attention diverted to something. So that's happening in the market, and it seems like it's correcting some.
Yeah.
But
I think having an appropriate slow and steady approach to wealth growth is not exciting. And
mm-hmm.
you feel, and of course there's FOMO, right? The fear of missing out when you hear
Yes,
someone talking about, oh, I invested in this and it's making all this money. And that certainly opens you up, like Kathy pointed out, to Ponzi schemes and things like that. I think generally one of the other rules of economics that we don't talk about maybe as much, but we should, is right, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
yes, we
Uh,
need to make an acronym for that, like Tonstoffel.
right?
I'll let you work on that, Tim.
I'm on
if
it.
if it sounds too good to be true, I don't know. I can't do the letters right now, but
Well,
yeah.
these get rich schemes, it's almost like a form of gambling, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're thinking you're going to put a little bit in and reap great rewards, which is similar to somebody playing the lottery or gambling or um, yeah, just investing unwisely.
Yeah, a few years ago, it was my son, and well, I don't know that he got in on it, but some of his friends did, got involved in that when GameStop stock was
GameStop.
going up. And so,
Hmm.
and of course, GameStop is a very exciting stock to you if you're a young man. You use this product, so you think, it can't fail because, a lot of
Yeah.
people around you like it. And so there were a couple of those of my son's friends who did make money on it, but there are many, many more who, took a bath. So anyway, well, Lee always talks to us about the fact that there are higher laws than the laws of men, and that those laws have a relationship to our freedom. So, Tim, do you want to read us our last passage?
Sure. I love this one. Um, there are two types of law. One is natural law, represented by the Old English common law. The premise of natural law is that there is a higher law than any government's law, and a judge's job is to discover and apply this higher law. Under natural law, an individual's rights to his life, freedom, and property are granted not by the government, but by, in the words of the American Declaration of Independence, the Creator. No human authority can reduce these rights. The natural law system grows out of two of the fundamental laws taught by all religions. Number one, do all you have agreed to do. This is the basis of contract law. And two, do not encroach on another person or their property. This is the basis of tort law and some criminal law. This is so good.
It is so good. And when we were having conversations in Challenge 3 one year, my students were saying, well, it's very tempting to think about the idea of private property as being an unchristian idea. So it's very tempting for them to think that as Christians, we should just distribute the money. And so we had a long conversation that day about, well, because the text that we were reading said, that the idea of contracts and property was extremely important to the founders of America. And they were trying to figure out, well, is private property a Christian idea or not? And eventually, as we worked our way through this question, they got back to the 10 Commandments and they said, oh, well, you can't tell people not to covet unless there's ownership. And then we backed up a little further and looked at one of the first contracts in the Bible, which is when Abraham buys the plot to bury Sarah in. And that's kind of the first contract in Scripture. He agrees they want to give him the plot, and he says, no, I'll pay you for it. And I need you to make sure that everyone knows that it belongs to me. And then they ratify this with an oath. So anyway, it was just a really interesting conversation. That's kind of how we got back to the idea of natural law. And I think it really changed some minds that day. It was an interesting conversation. So
yeah, it's also really important in the day that we live in, where there are very radically different views of what our Constitution is and what it's for, and what our laws are about, and what our government's purpose is. And to be reminded that our Constitution doesn't give us rights. It only lists the rights that we have and the government's obligation to not encroach on those rights. Mm-hmm. So our government doesn't give us rights. It just recognizes the rights that we already have. And I love that he boils it down to the two, do all you've agreed to do and don't encroach on other people's persons or their rights, their property rights. And that's what it is to be good, right? It's almost like the vertical and horizontal relationships in Scripture of, do what's right by God and do what's right by your neighbor. And this is the second half, do what's right by your neighbor.
Yeah. How about you, Kathy? Do you have thoughts about this one?
Yeah, I like the way Tim is explaining that. This whole this whole passage made me think about how we are stewards of everything God has given us. We're not stewards of our neighbor's property. We're stewards of our own property. And it has to do with taking responsibility for yourself, not expecting others to take responsibility for you, right? And that's freedom. And then being that good steward.
Yeah, that was another idea I talked about with my students. Sometimes Christians are uncomfortable with wealth, and I could see that in my students. And so we eventually wandered through that conversation. We wandered our way back to Boaz and Ruth, that it's actually really important that Boaz has all those vineyards. And as a good steward, he has the responsibility to leave the gleanings for the people who need them. And so
yeah. And like you were bringing up, Jennifer, at the very beginning of our time together about economics being management of the home at its root. And I think that this way to boil it down too gets at the root of what all of us as parents want for our children, right? That they would grow up to be the sort of person who would do the things that they've agreed to do, and that they would love their neighbor enough to not interfere with their neighbor's enjoyment of their property and their rights as people, right? If they're doing those things, then we've sort of won, right? We've raised adults who are living according to the standards of natural law, which are given, again, as Mayberry tells us, ultimately by God.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good word. And I think that's a good place for us to stop. And I'm really enjoying these conversations about economics and our applications of them to our homes. So we hope that you guys will keep joining us for the rest of the series, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Kathy. Bye.
Bye-bye.